Okay, guys, so we are going to start on chapter 10, and it's possible that I might need to take a break midway through this presentation, but I'm hoping we can make it through the whole thing in one sitting. If I need to stop the recording, I'll just let y'all know, and we'll pick up next time. Okay, so chapter 10, remember we said, is going to be really just kind of adding on to what we saw in chapter 9. So remember, chapter 9, we were talking about the basic court structure in Texas. Now we're going to be talking about that a little bit more in depth. So just as a means of reintroducing ourselves and reacquainting ourselves with the information that we already know, we're thinking back in our brains to chapter 9. Criminal cases, remember, are going to be prosecuted by public officials. It's a case that's brought by the state. And the general aim of that case, remember, is punishment. Civil cases, remember, are brought by a private person or institution, and the person who's initiating that case is called the plaintiff. Most of the time, what they're seeking, remember, is money. So this portion of your textbook talks a little bit more in depth about different types of civil law. There's a wide variety of different types of civil law, and they're not all going to be covered here. But this kind of gives you an overview of some of the things that fall within civil law. So family law is an example of this. Family law is where you're going in and you're seeking a divorce, or you're seeking the division of marital assets, or you're seeking child custody or child support, or you want to adopt a kiddo, or in a situation, which would be unfortunate, where we were seeking to terminate somebody's parental rights. All of those are going to deal with family law. So family law pertains to really just the family unit as a whole and the division of assets within that family unit. Real estate law is going to deal with real property interests. So anytime we're talking about land or anything associated with the land, that's going to be real estate law. Probate law we've talked about before because, as you recall from chapter 9, remember the county courts are going to have original jurisdiction. Hold on, guys. Two-minute break so I can quiet my puppies. Okay, sorry about that. So we've got probate law, which remember we talked about the county courts are going to have original jurisdiction over probate actions. So those are going to be those guardianship proceedings that we talked about where somebody is declared mentally incapacitated. It's also going to be the situation where you are trying to figure out where somebody's stuff is going to go after they pass away. Business regulations are going to relate to corporate law. So anytime somebody goes in and forms any type of business entity, whether we're talking about an LLC or we're talking about some other type of corporation, you're going to see those interests represented there. Contract law. That's when one individual agrees to do something in exchange for something else from another individual. So it's mutual obligation. Both sides are receiving some kind of legal detriment, and both sides are receiving some kind of legal benefit. Tort is going to be one area that your textbook actually expands upon a little bit. So let's talk about that one a little bit more in depth. Torts are a civil wrong that can be intentional or negligent, but they result in the injury of another person. So if you're on the golf course and you swing your golf club and you accidentally hit somebody in the head with a golf ball, that's an example of a tort. If you were to, you see all those advertisements with like the Texas Law Hawk, which is my favorite one, or the Texas Hammer, and they're like injured in a personal vehicle collision or in an 18-wheeler collision. Those are examples of torts. So torts are just examples of times when you are injured by another person through their wrongful conduct, whether they did it intentionally or just through some oversight on their part. Tort reform in Texas has become a really controversial issue. So tort reform just means an effort to limit liability in civil cases. Specifically, in Texas, we have made it incredibly difficult to go in and sue a doctor or a hospital for medical malpractice. It's almost impossible. There's a really good Dr. Death podcast that actually deals with this very issue. So if any of y'all are into podcasts at all, I highly recommend it. It's really good. And it talks about this neurosurgeon in Dallas who is performing brain and spine operations on patients while high on cocaine. Tort reform in Texas made it so that even those patients had a really difficult time going in and getting fully compensated for their injuries. It also makes a really compelling argument that the hospitals knew that their liability was going to be limited, and so they didn't take strong enough action against that doctor. Eventually, he was tried criminally, but you still had a lot of plaintiffs with a lot of injuries that weren't fully compensated. The way in which their injuries were really not compensated the way they should have been was through this thing called punitive damages. Punitive damages are when somebody does something really, really, really bad, and the court or the jury want to send a message that this thing you did, it was really bad. So the example that I think is most helpful for understanding punitive damages is the hot coffee McDonald's case. In that case, the woman spilled hot coffee on herself. She sued McDonald's. She got a whole bunch of money. Well, people were really, really upset because their argument was that she was negligent. How in the world? Of course, she should have expected that the coffee would be hot. Well, that wasn't really the point. The point was that the coffee was so hot that it actually caused third-degree burns. It caused her skin to meld to her clothing. She needed skin grafts afterwards. So even if she drank that coffee, it was going to be way, way, way too hot. And there were internal memos that were going back and forth between high-level executives at McDonald's, where they talked about the fact that they knew and understood that the coffee was at way too hot of a level and that somebody was likely to be injured by it. But they'd gone in and did a cost-benefit analysis and determined that it was going to cost them more money to throw out coffee sooner if they couldn't keep it at that high temperature than if somebody sued them. So the jury in that case awarded punitive damages to send a message to McDonald's, because McDonald's, if all they're charged with is, $500,000 in fines, well, that's not going to be a really big deal to McDonald's. They're a huge corporation. That's basically just the change in their couch. And so instead, what the jury was trying to do in that case was send a message by returning a really large judgment. Well, tort reform in Texas, as it pertains to hospitals and doctors, has really stopped that from happening. The argument in favor of it was that people were saying that doctors were paying way too high of premiums for liability insurance because of all of these frivolous lawsuits that were being filed. The truth of the matter is that there were very few frivolous lawsuits being filed, because most of the time, if you go in and you sue in a hospital, let's say, or a doctor and a hospital, the attorney who takes that case is going to take it for a percentage of the total amount recovered in judgment. So if you're awarded $30,000, maybe they take 15% of that or 20% of that. Well, at the end of the day, you're probably not going to spend your time, energy, and resources on filing a case where you think that you're never going to get paid. So tort reform in Texas has been really controversial, but for pretty good reasons. Eminent domain is also an area where we've seen some level of reform. So the United States Supreme Court has said that it is okay for the government to go in and take private property as long as it's for public use. That's provided for in the United States Constitution. Where it becomes a little bit more controversial is something called the Kelo case. In that case, the government in a particular city went in, took private property away from a private individual, and gave it to another private entity for a public purpose. They said that it was going to raise revenue in the surrounding area, raise tax income, because they took it away and gave it to somebody who was going to develop a retail shopping center. People in Texas were not very big fans of this idea, so they made it a lot harder for the government to come in and take away private property and give it to another private individual or entity, even if it was for a public use. Now, one of the big exceptions to this, though, that you do see is sports stadiums. Texans love their sports ball, so you're going to see that the government's able to go in and take that property away if we're talking about the Cowboy Stadium or the Rangers or whatever else, with a lot less impediments than it sees, generally speaking. Okay, crime. So that was kind of our more in-depth discussion of civil law. Now we're going to move over to a more in-depth discussion of criminal law. When we talk about criminal law, we're talking about crime. So this is something that our society has decided is bad. That can range from a really low-level offense, which is going to be known as a misdemeanor, all the way up to a higher-level offense. So a serious crime. That's going to be known as a felony. Misdemeanors are things like you had a little bit of marijuana on you, or, although I hate using this one as an example because I think it should probably be a harsher punishment, your first-time conviction for a DUI. That's going to be an example of a misdemeanor. These are things that our society has decided are bad, but aren't as bad as things that we consider to be felony offenses. Examples of felonies would be things like murder or robbery or burglary. Within both of those sets, sometimes you see this thing called victimless crime. The idea of victimless crime is that sometimes we go in and we prosecute individuals who are the ones who are most likely to be harmed by an offense. So examples of this would include penalizing individuals for possessing a small amount of cocaine. Well, it was pretty likely that that individual was probably going to ingest the cocaine themselves. So we're prosecuting the person who is also most likely to see adverse reactions or consequences as a result. Another example is prostitution. We go in and we prosecute individuals who are working as prostitutes. But prostitutes are the ones who are most putting themselves at risk for being the victims of violent offenses or for contracting sexually transmitted diseases. So some people argue that we shouldn't prosecute those types of crimes. The flip side to that, though, is that there's a reason that society does that, and it's because they think that if you look further out, those crimes are going to affect other people. So if somebody is addicted to drugs, then their likelihood of committing crime goes up. Also, if somebody's working as a prostitute, they are probably engaging in sexual relations with other individuals who are not prostitutes, some of which might have other types of relationships going on in their life. So for society as a whole, that can actually cause a further permutation when it comes to sexually transmitted diseases. So there's two sides of that victimless crimes debate. Don't feel like you need to memorize this. This is just a graph that is designed to show you. We've got everything down here from low-level Class C misdemeanors. That's the lowest level offense that somebody can commit, all the way up to capital murder, which is going to be the highest level offense. If somebody commits capital murder, they are subject to execution. So one of their potential sentences could be the death penalty. Now notice that there's very specific examples of when somebody is eligible for a conviction in capital murder and a sentence of death. It can't just be that you killed somebody. It has to meet these certain criteria. The one thing I am going to say about this slide, that is wrong. That was recently updated. So now it's murder of a child that's 10 or under. So murder of a first responder, murder of a kiddo that's under the age of 10, if you're above that age, or apparently just on your own in the state of Texas, murder that's committed with certain other felonies, that's going to be the one that we see most often. So somebody was killed in the course of a robbery or a burglary, and then mass murder, so you went out and killed a bunch of people. All of those are going to be eligible for the death penalty. So your textbook goes in and defines the typical demographics that we see for individuals who are likely to commit crime. On the whole, disproportionately, we see young, poor members of racial or ethnic minority groups convicted of offenses. Age, if you think about that, is probably going to make a lot of sense because you're likely to do stupider things when you're younger. The older you get, the more developed your brain is, and the more you understand the consequences of your decisions. So one of the things that this section of your textbook talks about is the incidence of crime and whether it's going up or down, and how do we measure that? We measure it through something called FBI index crimes. So FBI index crimes are crimes that are used as a national barometer of the crime rate. These are things that are generally going to be violent offenses or things that could lead to being violent offenses. So things like murder, non-negligent manslaughter, rape, robbery, although I will point out that your textbook calls it forcible rape. I don't know if there's really another type of rape, but forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, grand theft, and motor vehicle theft. Those are going to be some examples of FBI index crimes, things that are either violent crimes or have a strong likelihood to become violent in the course of their commission. Okay, the criminal that we see convicted is most often going to be male. Their income and education level are going to be limited. Makes more sense, right? The less opportunities that you have in life, the more likely you are to look for alternative means of making income, like dealing drugs, prostitution, things like that. You're also more likely to become involved in a gang culture. Ethnicity and race we'd already discussed. Urban life, you're going to see more criminals who are convicted that are actually within a more urban context. If you live in a more rural society, there's a variety of reasons that you're less likely to commit crime, some of which are just practicality. You're more likely to be caught, right? Even low-level offenses in a more rural place like Carthage, Texas, since we pick on Carthage, Texas during the course of this course, if your bike were to be stolen in Dallas, nobody's going to care. But if your bike is stolen in Carthage, like the police are probably actually going to care about that. And your neighbors are going to know about Susie Q, who's now pedaling a bike that looks suspiciously like yours. So you're going to see urban areas on the whole have more criminal activity. You also see a correlation to drug addiction and access to weapons. The one exception to these demographics that we generally see is white-collar crime. So let's talk a little bit about that. What is white-collar crime? White-collar crime is crimes like bribery, tax fraud, business fraud, price fixing, embezzlement. And these are usually committed by more prosperous people who have often benefited from the very best advantages that society has to offer. And the demographics for white-collar crime look a lot different than other types of crime. We're usually talking about Anglo, higher education level, higher income level, and usually older as well. So those white-collar crime demographics look a lot different. A good example of somebody who is convicted of white-collar crime that a lot of people know about would be Martha Stewart. Or if you watch The Real Housewives, for example, that would be an example of white-collar crime, Teresa Giudice. Or if you watch Dance Moms, Abby Lee Miller, bankruptcy fraud, it basically all revolves around money. Okay, so the victim. The demographics of the victim are often going to mirror that of the criminal because highest rates of victimization are actually going to occur in poor sections of cities. Often, these crimes are committed in neighborhoods against friends and family members of the criminal. And remember that the Texas Constitution provides that victims actually have the right to be informed of investigations and court proceedings. So let's take a look real quick at those crime rates that we were talking about. Even though the media kind of makes it seem like crime is on the rise, when we look at violent crime rates and when we look at the index crime rates, so things that are violent or that have the propensity to become violent, we actually see those decreasing over time. Okay, before we move on to the next section, we're going to break here. I'm actually going to break this recording into two separate parts. So stay tuned for part 2.